Hey everybody, this is Danny Ritchie and welcome back again to GR Research, where again today we have another tale of two speakers. These are speakers that have been sent in to us again this week, and we have a vintage KEF model over here to my right, the model 204. Here in front of me we have the SVS center channel. It's their top model center channel, the Ultra model I think it's called. And this one's going to be an interesting comparison. Here we have a vintage speaker versus a new and modern speaker. So interesting comparison. And I have a lot of people emailing me all the time asking me about upgrading vintage speakers. And some of them we can do something with. Some of them are worth working with, and some of them are not worth it. Some of them have, of course, they have the big boxes that are wide, and they may have a big lower frequency driver, but they'll have mids here and tweeters over here, and sometimes two tweeters and a super tweeter, and all kinds of crazy things. And sometimes when they're like that, there's just no fixing them. There's no fixing engineering problems where you got multiple drivers covering the same signal and things like that. You can't fix it. On the other hand, this little KEF model here is still a simple two-way design. It's got a nice dome tweeter and what looks like about a 7-inch or 8-inch woofer there, and it's a simple two-way design. And so possibilities, we can do something with this one. And then we're going to look at that compared to a brand new speaker here and look at the differences and try to figure out where is really the best value. Let's first look at the cabinet that the KEF came in here. The cabinet is mostly particle board. The front baffle and rear baffle are just particle board. The sides are solid wood, and there's no bracing in it, so pretty lightly constructed box. I think these are about 1/2-inch panels, and you can even tell by tapping on it, just very thin material. The SVS, on the other hand, looks to have maybe a 1-inch thick front baffle, 3/4-inch material. There's separate compartments in here that are breaking this thing apart. Pretty solid and beautifully painted. I mean, piano black, gorgeous, looks nice. Driver wise, the old KEF there, it's got a nice little dome tweeter. There's nothing wrong with the little dome tweeter. And the woofer does have a stamped steel frame, but it's a nice paper cone based treated paper woofer, and it had a pretty nice response. Below it is this massive passive radiator that's tuning it to 40 hertz, and it's like a chunk of polystyrene there on it, and the tuning on it worked really well. Whereas the SVS is dual ported, it's got ports in the rear. It's a true three-way design, designed to be used as a center channel. The frames are cast frames. The construction of the woofer is really not a lot different than the old vintage. A little bigger motor structure. Pretty nice looking frames, nicely built drivers. So, okay, how do they measure though? What's the engineering on these things? How well were they engineered? Let's take a look at these things. Let's first take a look at the KEF speaker here. Frequency response on the KEF speaker. A little choppy, but maintains a really good average. So pretty balanced from one end to the other. Spectral decay on it shows a little bit of resonance issues going on there, a little ringing coming off the drivers. Not bad, but definitely something going on there. The horizontal off axis looks about normal for a typical two-way. It's got a lot of surface area around the tweeter on the sides, but other than that, it's not too bad. The vertical off axis, as you move up vertically, you can see the crossover point is near 3 kHz, so you start to see a dropout in the output. So not great in the vertical off axis. Impedance is fairly smooth, tuned to 40 Hertz. It's got a pretty good rise there in the middle, but overall, not bad. What about flashing forward 30 years or something like that? How much better is the modern speaker? Well, if you look at the frequency response, the on-axis response, and this is on tweeter axis from 1 meter away, it's pretty choppy, and there's some Significant peaks and dips around the crossover point between the mid and the tweeter. Looks a little rough. It was a bi-wireable speaker, so I could disconnect one of the plates off of the side there and measure the tweeter mid individually from the woofers. And if you look at it there, you can see the woofers roll off fairly smoothly. They're crossing at about 550, 560. And that roughness in the response is going on between the mid and the tweeter. As you go off axis horizontally, you can see that it maintains a pretty good response horizontally. Because it's a three-way design, you're really looking at the tweeter and the little mid driver there. So as you move off horizontally, it's dropping off normally as you would with any tweeter mid combination there, one over another, which is good for a center channel application, because as you move left or right in the soundstage, in other words, your seating is not right in front of it, it still maintains a pretty even response. In fact, I noticed that as you move 10 degrees off axis, the response is actually smoother than it is on axis. And if you look at the vertical off axis, this was a surprise. This was starting off measuring it in line with the tweeter and moving up 4 inches at a time at a meter away. And as I went up, it just kept getting smoother. So at 12 inches up, it actually had a smoother response than it did on axis. So if you've got this sitting on a stand below your TV and your seating is a little higher than the speaker, you're still going to get a pretty smooth response out of this thing. If you had it above the screen, it would probably not work so well. You wouldn't want to be lower than the tweeter axis as you're listening to the speaker, but on axis and above axis, not too bad. Spectral decay, no real ringing anything going on there. I mean, there's a few areas there where there's still some carry out of energy there, but not too bad. Again, I've measured another one that was just the vertical off axis, and I showed it just at 12 inches above tweeter, and that's the smoothest response that it had. So you'd think on surface, well, this one measured smoother on axis, this one measured a little better off axis, but what are they going to sound like? How do we really break this thing down a little further? Well, what you hear is more than just a reflection of the frequency response. The parts that are involved play a significant role in how good it sounds. The quality of those parts, the quality of the wire, the quality of the bonding posts, and the things that are in the signal path that begin to degrade the sound. Let's start with the bonding posts. And if we look at this little jewel here, it really doesn't even have bonding posts at all. It's got some push-on connectors, some little spring-loaded clips that you slide your bare wire into, and that's what holds it. Not exactly ideal, but the SVS, which has some really pretty dual bonding posts on here, has steel screws on the back. This is our little Neo magnets here. Not only are the screws steel, but the terminals themselves are steel that it mounts to. You're passing your signal through a piece of steel. This isn't even brass, certainly not copper. It could be tin with some nickel, but it's definitely got some steel in it. It's definitely not ideal. This is not what you want in the signal path. And if you start looking at the quality of the crossover, you don't see much difference between the two. If you look in the old KEF, if you look back in the back here, you can see in the back a bunch of electrolytic capacitors and a couple of really small iron core inductors, some inexpensive resistors that were used at the time. At least they weren't sandcast resistors, but some inexpensive resistors, and pretty much your budget level parts. Also, the inductors were very small gauge, and the wiring, I don't know if you can see it here, I want to say is about 21 gauge, maybe 20 gauge. It's smaller than our 18 gauge wire that we have in here. This is pretty thin wiring. The wiring on the SVS, though, definitely not copper. If it's copper, it's tinned copper. It could be silver coated copper, but I doubt it because it's PVC jacketed. It's not Teflon jacketed. So it's either tinned copper or it's aluminum. Either way, not pure copper, and all the drivers have push-on terminals, which again, not the kind of thing you want in the signal path. And what about the crossover on this one? Does it get any better? I mean, this is the hard, this is the meat and potatoes of it. How good are the internals on this? Well, if you can look inside and see, you'll see the woofer circuit on this side. So all the wires run to this circuit, and then they're split to the two woofers. And all the inductors are iron core. All the capacitors are electrolytic. So the budget of budget parts. If you look over in the other side over here, you see the crossover for the mid-tweeter. And if you look way in the back, you'll see one tiny little air core inductor and one little polycap. And all the other inductors are all iron core inductors, or laminated iron core inductors. And all the rest of the capacitors are all electrolytic. All of the resistors are all sandcast resistors. And if you look at the ends of the sandcast resistors, the standoffs on it, I can stick the magnet to it there. I don't know if you can hear that, but that's the magnet grabbing the legs on those resistors, which are just some form of a steel or composite steel, some type of a steel leg that it stands off on. Crazy. It is the cheapest parts that you could stick in this thing. And I went to the website to look up some information on this so I could see what does it sell for and what is this wire that they're using on here. So a couple of things kind of stood out to me and made me think, wow, that's funny. And sometimes when the marketing department gets a hold of something and they start doing the creative writing, you just look at it and you think, what? Too funny. Here's a couple of things that just made me laugh. Every feature on the Ultra Center Channel speakers cabinet was designed with a sonic purpose in mind. Tapered edges on the cabinet's front baffle, notice chamfers, minimize edge diffraction for clear and precise sound staging. That's funny. You're not going to change the sound staging too much by knocking a little edge off the corner here. It is affected by all the surface area that is around the tweeter and the mid bass driver. And what's really going to affect it, not this piece here, but the inside edges of the through hole. You notice the driver through holes are cut, but there's no radius on the back side of them. And you can kind of get by with it with these because they're not playing up too high, but you can't really get by with it on the mid. If you notice the mid, it's not real tall. And the baffle's about 1 inch thick, and the recessed area is a little less than 1/4 of an inch. So you've got 3/4 of an inch of material that this thing is setting down in. So it's basically putting it into a cylinder, and it just lets it breathe out the very back side of it here, just a little bit below the spider, and maybe just a little on the inside. And that sharp edge in there is going to cause some diffraction. Probably one of the causes of some of that frequency response choppiness that you see right there as it's trying to reach that tweeter. So nice work cutting the corners off of here, guys, but you really should round the inside edge off of there and do away with that diffraction and let that air flow a little more smoothly around the inside of it. So that was funny to me. Also, there was some information on their site about their crossover. They had a picture of the crossover for this speaker, but it didn't match this one. This crossover has everything on one circuit board, whereas clearly it's split into 2 circuit boards. But the information says the 3-way crossover design is imperative for a truly stand-out center channel. The Ultra Center Channel features a unique SBS sound match 3-way crossover with precisely tuned crossover frequencies and slopes that result in a smooth off-axis response. It does have good off-axis response. Premium audio-grade capacitors, air core inductors, and other high-end components ensure pristine signal transmission and utter neutrality. Funny. It only had one air core inductor in it. It was on the tweeter circuit. All the rest are iron core. There's no premium grade capacitors in this speaker. There's one polycap. The rest are all electrolytic. You can kind of see them even looking through the cabinet there, all electrolytics in there. So that was funny to me. And the marketing department, again, they precisely tuned crossover frequencies. Frequency, by the way, is the way you measure something. It's not something that comes from the speaker. Frequencies don't come out of the speaker. Frequency is the way you measure. Frequency is the number of periods or regularly occurring events of any given kind in a unit of time. In other words, the wavelength is an up and a down waveform. That's whatever frequency that is, it's how frequently it happens. So that's thus the word frequency. We're usually measured in 1 second. The number of cycles or completed alterations per unit of time or wave of oscillation. That's what it means when we say frequency. It means how frequent something happens. There's not frequencies coming out of the speaker. It's so funny to me when I see that. So, what are the better candidates here to upgrade these things? Are the older models like a vintage speaker a better candidate for upgrade, or buying something new? We can obviously see sometimes buying a brand new speaker, even something that's a lot more expensive, doesn't necessarily give you better quality. The parts inside are still just as cheesy in this speaker as they are in this speaker, even though there's a huge disparity of time between the two. This speaker here, you could probably find them in a thrift store or something somewhere for $100, $150 a pair. So let's say you spend, $150 on them. If I designed a new crossover for these things and we put higher quality parts in them, you might have $100, maybe at the most $150 per speaker in the upgrade. And so you still don't have a lot in it, but the performance may actually be pretty good. I mean, I don't see any reason why I can't create a smooth frequency response out of it. Using the old parts that are in there, they've created a pretty smooth frequency response. I could probably work on that time domain a little bit between the two drivers and smooth out that vertical off axis a little bit. So, kind of makes it look pretty attractive, doesn't it? Now this center channel over here, it sells for $699. Ooh, $699. Now you go through and you start taking all the crap out of the signal path, like all of these connectors and this stuff that's ferromagnetic. You use good wire and no push-on connectors, and actually use the high-quality premium parts that they advertise. You could probably spend, throw in a sheet of no-res, $300, $350 easily, because it is a three-way design, so crossover gets a little more complex. So now you're into it for $1,000. You may be into something like this, a vintage speaker for $500 for the pair after all the upgrading. So, sometimes it's worth it to take an older speaker or even an inexpensive speaker and start upgrading the parts quality on it, and you could get far greater sound quality than you could if you were just spending big bucks on something new that looks pretty on the outside, but on the inside may not amount to anything. You never know. And while we're talking about these parts, let's look a little bit at the crossover parts and talk about why they're so different and what makes such a difference. Let's start with the binding post cups. This is a lot to pass the signal through. Even these straps that go from one end to the other, that's not what you want your signal passing through. Best thing to do is gut these things. And what we recommend is a set of tube connectors. Now, how does a tube connector work? We've talked about tube connectors before. Tube connector is a solid copper tube, hollow all the way through. It has a male end that's also hollow all the way to the tip, and it inserts into it and clamps down on it and holds it. So how that works is you have your external speaker wire and you slide it all the way through to the tip. So you got that much wire in the male plug. Then when you insert it into it, you're creating a stop point for your internal speaker wire, and you're sliding your internal speaker wire in. So it's tip-to-tip contact, you're crimping it. And what you really wind up with is you wind up with your external speaker wire and your internal speaker wire almost tip-to-tip surrounded by a copper tube. So very, very little loss of signal. Very little between your internal speaker wire and your external speaker wire. Versus, in this case, you're putting a lot of different material. And anytime you're passing the signal through materials and they become different types of material, even getting into steel and things like that, you're degrading the signal a lot. It's not the same passing from one to the other. And the difference sonically is amazing. It's not subtle sometimes. When you're stuck with this stuff to begin with, and you upgrade to some tube connectors, it's not subtle. Or when you're stuck with something like these push-on spring-loaded connectors, not subtle. So there are ways you can do that. And but a good speaker like this, you may only need to line it with a little no-res, and you're good. This cabinet's going to need some help. I would probably start by lining the whole thing with maybe a 1/4 inch sheet of MDF, just to change the density and add some density to it, add some mass to it. Then go in with some small bracing and tighten that thing up, and then line the whole thing with no-res. And you could make a pretty decent box out of this thing. I mean, it's starting off bad. This is gonna buzz. This is a buzz box, but you can fix it. So that's not a huge problem. The parts quality. Let's talk about inductors. And this one we noticed there were a lot of iron core inductors. What's the difference between an iron core inductor like this model from Ursi or this Super Q iron core inductor versus an air core inductor? Let's talk just a little bit about how that works and why go with one of these versus an air core inductor, which is commonly known to sound better. This is a 3 millihenry inductor. This one is a 12 millihenry inductor. Now, if this were an air core like this one, the size of it would be about like this. It'd be about this thick, and just to keep the DCR down, we'd probably have to go to 10 or 12 gauge to have a DCR similar to what this one is. So that gets economically unfeasible. So you wind up putting a core through it. And the better cores are the laminated cores. And this one has some laminated cores. Laminated I-core. This is what's called an I-core. And it discharges a lot faster than a solid slug. What I mean by that is, if you remember when you were a kid in junior high and you took a nail and you wrapped a copper wire around the nail and you stuck it to a battery, the nail became magnetized. You made an electromagnet. So then you take it off of the battery, and now it's no longer electromagnet. It's back to being a nail. But there's a residual charge still left on the nail. The nail still has a little bit left on it because you put that charge on it. Well, the iron cores that are in the inductors work a little the same way. With the signal passing over it and around it, it will hold a little bit of a residual charge, especially when you start getting up into ranges where it's starting to saturate the core. And those little bit of residual charges, what they do is they tend to smear the signal. They tend to just smudge the mid-range, and the detail levels are just kind of smeared because it's holding them a little longer. Versus the air core, there's nothing there. There's nothing to hold that charge. It dissipates a lot more quickly, just more expensive. So to save money, a lot of these companies will put an iron core inductor in there. Now, another point on this speaker, the crossover point was about 550 hertz between the outer woofers and the little mid in the middle. So they're crossing right in the vocal region. I mean right in the heart of the vocal. 300 hertz to 500 hertz. There's your vocal region. So you've got signal split between those two drivers. You got a different offset because the voice coils are further back on one than they are on the other. And then you've got the smearing effect of the coils. You got muddy vocals. No way around it. That's the physical limitations of the whole situation there. It's when you can get away with an I-core inductor, or like this one from Ursi, is when the range that the woofer's playing is about 200 hertz and down. If you're limiting it to about 200 hertz and down, you're down out of the vocal region. You're into those lower frequencies where it's harder to hear the smear because the wavelengths are so long. Any little holding of that signal and that information is a little more covered up by the fact of the moving force of the woofer and how much it's moving. It's not going to become as apparent down below 200 hertz that you're using an I-core versus an air core. As soon as you get up into that 300 to 500 range there, it starts becoming real apparent. that this sounds a lot cleaner than one of these. So there are good times to use these things, and there are times you don't want to use them. And in this case, not only are in the low frequency drivers, they're in the mid-range drivers too. So the whole thing is kind of muddied with a laminated cord inductor. So a lot of room for improvement there. Same goes for this model. There was a little iron core, and it's a real little dental floss gauge one in this one. So this stuff makes a big difference, big difference. Let's look briefly at the capacitors. I got 3 little capacitors over here. They're all the same value. Look at them here. There's an electrolytic capacitor, 10 microfarad, probably costs less than $1. Electrolytic caps are very cheap, and that's why you see them loaded in a speaker like this, because they're cheap. Electrolytic capacitors are slower discharging. So imagine signal goes in, holds the signal, and then dissipates the signal. So it discharges it. So you get a smearing effect because of the electrolytic capacitors. Now when you step up into something like a polycap, Solon used to call their polycaps fast caps because the polypropylene caps discharge a lot faster. So signal in, signal out. Very little smearing, lots cleaner. A little more expensive, $3.75 for the same 10 microfarad cap. Next, we stock tons of Sonicaps. Sonicaps are really high in capacitor. There's a whole lot of things going on in here the way this is made to maintain purity of the signal. So signal in, signal out. Doesn't hold it and store it as long as bad. Dissipates it really cleanly, and the materials that are used in it are much cleaner in the way it lets the signal transfer through the dielectric material. A whole lot cleaner sounding. They're a little more pricey. $30.90, I believe, is what a 10 microfarad goes for now. So you can see a big jump in price. So if all these capacitors used in here were a bunch of Sonicaps in this 3-way design, you'd probably have $300 worth of Sonicaps in this thing real easily. So you can't blame them for not putting the really high quality premium parts in there that they claim, because then they would have to sell for $1,600. Now, the good news is, as a consumer, you can go in and upgrade these things. You can change out these electrolytics for some of the just good old polycaps in some applications. Then maybe in the tweeter circuit, you might want to put some Sonicaps in there, because that's where you really hear that high frequency detail. So upgrading the parts quality, huge difference in performance. You can do that in the vintage speakers, you can do it in the newer speakers, and I see this even in speakers that are $3,000 a pair. They're still loaded with these cheap parts. So there's always room for improvements and upgrades, even in the resistors. This Mills resistor here is about $8. That's what they retail for now. They're a little pricey, but there's no ferrous material in here. There's nothing in here that the magnet's going to stick to. It's all copper or brass, and it sounds really good. The sandcast resistors, which have steel end caps on them, don't sound as good. They smear the signal, but they're about 12 cents a piece. So 12 cents a piece, maybe 15 cents versus an $8 resistor. No brainer. You're never going to see it. It's the outside you're going to see. It looks beautiful on the outside. You're not going to see what's on the inside. And besides, you probably can't hear it before you buy it anyway. You're probably just ordering off the internet, or you heard some guy on a video tell you how great it was because it's 3-way design. Whew. What do you guys think? Upgrade to a new modern speaker and then go in and upgrade it and try to make something out of it? Or start with an older vintage speaker and upgrade that and make something out of it? You got to remember too, a lot of this upgrading for a lot of these people is their fun. The fun is the upgrade. So if you're having fun doing the upgrade, you need a project while you're sitting at home because you're quarantined, whatever the reason may be. There are ways you can spend a little bit of money sometimes and make your speakers sound a lot better. And upgrading is a fun way to do it. Guys, thanks for watching the video. Please hit the subscribe button so you can get notification of our newer videos as they come out. Go visit us at GR Research if you want to check out some of our kits. And even some of the upgrades that we've done are listed there on the page on our new website. We're selling so many of those clips upgrades because those people that have clips are just, they're loving these upgrades. They were buying so many of them. I had to put them on the website. So you can just click on those clips upgrades and order them online. Again, thanks for tuning in again this week. And tune in again next week. We'll maybe be doing some more upgrades. Also, be sure and hit the subscribe button and the little bell notification button down there so you'll have notification when we have new videos that drop. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you again next week.